Hello and welcome back. I am Chris with Marksman Shooting Sports and WeBuyGuns.com in Westfield, Indiana, and you are watching Marksman TV. Welcome back to another weekly used gun review. Sorry, I have been off for a couple weeks. For those of you who did not watch my most recent vlog, I was on vacation for a week. Randy was on vacation for a week, so there was just a lot going on. I'm now getting back into the swing of things, so I'm going to try and get these back on track. But anyway, the purpose of this video is strictly to be entertaining and educational. I'm not making this video to sell anything, to keep it in accordance with YouTube's policies. We bring about 8 firearms that have come in through the door or through our website, give you guys about a 2 to 4 minute review of each to show you guys some different cool and interesting stuff out there on the market. So without further ado, let's go ahead and jump into it now. Alright, this video is brought to you by our new website, WeBuyGuns.com. If you are considering selling a firearm or firearms collection, please consider logging on to our site, create an account, and there you can submit your firearms for an offer request. Now with that offer, you will get a printable offer certificate, which you can take with you to competing gun stores in your area to try and leverage yourself a better deal. If you're unable to get a better deal, go ahead and sell it to us. We do provide you with a shipping label, and we will pay you with either an ACH direct deposit or paper check to make the process as easy for you as possible. So please remember to go check us out at WeBuyGuns.com. Okay, remembering the format of this video is we're going to start with most common and move through least common as the video progresses. Starting us off with our first spot is an interesting firearm that comes to us from a viewer in Iowa. This is a GSG STG-44 22 caliber semi-automatic clone of the famous STG-44 Sturmgewehr assault rifle, which came out of Germany in the Second World War. Now, if we really look at the development of the original rifle, the Sturmgewehr, it would really get its start in probably, we would say, around 1941 with the German invasion of Russia and Operation Barbarossa. Now, if we look at the weapons tactics employed by both Russia and Germany during the Second World War, they did follow a little bit of a different doctrine. Germany was mainly focused around the machine gun being the central point of the fighting force of the squad, usually supported by light infantry with K98s, rifle grenades, and usually your squad leader was something like an MP40 submachine gun or a machine pistol. In Russia, it was really meant to create, or what Russian military tactics wanted to create was a higher volume of fire being able to be produced more at the granule level, so each infantryman being armed with something with a little bit more of something that could produce a higher volume of fire. You would have early adoption of the SVT-38 and later the SVT-40 rifles, which were intended to actually be the main replacement or the main standard issue rifle. There just weren't enough of them produced by the outbreak of the Second World War, so you did still see a lot of Mauser guns being used, 9130s. But also the development of the PPSH-41 submachine gun, which by late in the war was actually being issued at a massive level. You would usually see squads armed with nothing but PPSH-41s. So when you have close-in fightings, which happen often during the campaign with Germany and Russia during Operation Barbarossa, you would see, or German tacticians would start to see the field superiority provided by higher volume of fire producing firearms being issued to basically who it may concern, at a larger volume on the field. What they wanted to do was create rifles like this of their own, so they would start with a semi-automatic weapons program, which would turn into the G41, later the G and K43 rifles. But the G41 or the Gewehr 41 was not easy to produce, and it was often complicated and did not have a lot of reliability in the field. They also wanted to move into something that had select fire capability, but they realized that a full-powered 8mm Mauser round was difficult to control in full auto, so they wanted to come up with something of a smaller caliber, thus coming up with an intermediate cartridge, the 7.92 by 33mm Kurz, or the 8mm Kurz round, which you would find in here. Now, early development for the first 2 prototype rifles that would be chambered for that round would be the NKB-42H for Heinel and W for Walther. There were 2 prototype rifles. And what they first meant to do was to replace the K98 entirely in service. So they would be incorporated with things like grenade launching capabilities, bayonet lugs, and things like that. Now, through testing, it was determined that these are not easy to launch grenades off of. They were also not accurate, so you couldn't use them for sniping or for designated marksman purposes. So later on, they would decide to make this more of an ancillary rifle, so they would simplify it, water it down, and come out with the first real production variation of it known as the MP43. Now, around this time, there was a lot of political turmoil happening in Germany, and Hitler himself is not in favor of going to this whole new weapon system with a whole new cartridge, and he himself was a believer in the traditional machine pistol and rifle plus, the machine gun, the MG34 and later the MG42. sort of development of the squad. Now, the German military offices, or the weapons offices, wanted to continue with the production of the rifle, which is why they would go with the designation MP for Machine Pistol 43. Continuing the project, they would continue it in through 1944 as the MP44. By then, Hitler was brought on board with the project. He had actually liked what he had seen with the final development, the sort of assembly production of the rifle, christening it the Sturmgewehr STG-44. It would be produced in 45, and then production would cease in 1945 at the end of the war, although they would continue to see service in Germany as well as other countries around the world post-World War II. Now that brings us to 2012, when this company, GSG, decided to make a copy of the rifle, importing it into the United States as a .22 caliber. Now, due to importation laws, they were kind of restricted at keeping it at a low caliber. Other companies like Hill and Mac locally had wanted to come out with a 7.62x39 or 7.92x33 millimeter Kurtz variation of the rifle, but as far as I know, that project has kind of been scrapped. And there was a PTR 44, which is really the only real semi-automatic production STG-44 clone that you can buy. They're getting very expensive, other than people taking parts kits and making semi-automatic conversions. So if you want to get into something like this, generally on the market, used, you find them for about the $500 mark, and it is a really good close facsimile of the original Sturmgewehr rifle. In fact, if I am able to ever get my hands on a real one, hopefully sooner rather than later, and I have one of these, I will be happy to do a comparison. But based on what I've heard from people who own real ones and looking at this, it is a very good close facsimile. So for $500 to get something that really looks the part is a good option. GSG, they make a MP40 clone as well, which I've done a comparison with a real MP40 on the channel, and that actually wasn't super close, but this I hear is much closer. Interesting firearm, would be a cool sort of stand-in for a hole filler and a collection, a World War II collection. So very interesting, happy to get this in and share it with you guys. So that is a GSG STG 4422LR clone of the famous MP43, MP44, STG-44 rifle from the Second World War. All right, up next is a pretty interesting rifle that comes to us from a local customer. This is a Chinese Type 24 Mauser, and this is derived off of the model 1933 pattern of the German Mauser, which is actually manufactured by China under license from Germany on that pattern. Now, this was given the name the Type 24 because it was developed in 1935, which was the 24th year of the Chinese Republic. Also, other names given to this rifle were the Chiang, which is the Cantonese pronunciation, or the Jiangjishi, which is the Mandarin pronunciation of this rifle, named after a prominent politician and general in China at the time. Now, this would be produced from 1935 to about 1949, so this would be China's primary issue rifle throughout the World War II years, also seeing some use in the Second Sino-Japanese War, as well as actually the war in Korea as well, the Korean War. Chinese versus UN forces, of course, 1950 to 1953. We are all very familiar. So this would be one of the primary issue rifles at the time. It was actually chambered in 8mm Mauser, being a derivative or a licensed copy of the German design, which is one of the main draws that China had with this rifle, as opposed to going to something that was more closely related to home, like the Arasaka variants in the 6.5 and the 7.7. It was believed that the 8mm Mauser would have a lot more lethality, stopping power, and things like that, so these would be developed. Now, about 500,000 of these would be produced, and they are, gosh, I should say, even though they made a lot of them, you don't tend to see a lot of these Chiang Kai-shek rifles show up on the surplus market that often, and I, as a collector, don't really, I have not really seen a lot of them show up either. In fact, I've seen very few of these at gun shows and gun shops and things like that, so they are not super common, although there is not a lot of, Chinese arms collecting that does go on within the surplus community. So these are still pretty affordable, and you can find them at a very low price. As an interesting Mauser variant, it is an interesting sort of rifle to add to any collection, and a World War II era collection at that. You should be able to find one of these on the market, maybe around the $300 to $500 range, depending on condition, matching numbers, and things like that. So really cool nonetheless. Not much else really to say about it, but just wanted to share it with you guys on this video. And that is a Chinese Type 24 Mauser Chiang Kai-shek Jiangjishi rifle. Okay, up next is a really cool and really popular pistol. This is a Sig Sauer P229, which comes out of their Legion series. And this one is brought to us by a local customer here. Now, the P220 would actually come about in 1975 and was meant to replace the then service issue P210 model in the Swiss military. It was adopted in 1975 in 9mm, and it was also adopted by Denmark as well as Japan as their service sidearms as well. Now, the P220 would lead into the springboard for the P226, which in my opinion is arguably one of the most popular, most prolific, and most successful handgun designs on the market, seeing probably more military and police use around the world than most other handgun designs, including the P220. That is a personal favorite of mine, that being chambered in 9, 40, and 357 SIG. Now, even though this was originally intended for 9mm, today it is most popularly found or known for being a 45 ACP or 10mm. This one is a 45 SAO, single action only, so no decocker. And this one has a really nice single action trigger and reset. Now, the P220 is still in production today, and a lot of people would say, what is the viability of a single stack 45 ACP in such a large design? But we are still in the era of 1911, so this, I would say, would compete really with the 1911 market. If you're a big fan of the 1911, actually the balance and the weight would be very comfortable, in my opinion, especially in an SAO design like this. Now, when it comes to the Legion series, I personally find a lot of interest in looking at the nuances of business decisions and sort of nitpicking those little details out of companies, and the Legion series is actually a really interesting thing to look at when it comes from SIG. Now, the Legion line would be introduced just a few years ago and was a really interesting branding idea, in my opinion, from SIG. Now, SIG has always been known for taking one of their pistol designs and reshaping it and rebranding it, or putting a million different colors or different options or different triggers in it or sights or anything like that. The Elite series, the Equinox series, the Nitron series, they have all these different series that have come and gone over the years, but the main base pistols have stayed the same and more or less unchanged since their inception. So to keep a design like this new and refreshed here in 2021 from something that was designed in 1975 is really where a lot of the genius from SIG comes from, in my opinion. The Legion series is really most noted as you can find the Legion chevron emblems on the grips and also the dark gray finish on the slide in the frame. You have a nice upgraded trigger. You have front sight serrations, usually upgraded. The Romeo X-Ray 3 sights, really nice grip scales, and just the stylizing is very, I would say, professional and very clean looking, very sleek. Now, with the purchase of this, you would get a normal SIG hard case, but then you would take your firearm, register it online, and you would be inducted into the SIG Legion Club with this sort of thermo zippable case and the coin that would come with it. And then on their website, that would grant you access to only the Legion accessories parts of their website. So really interesting way to get SIG shooters into the exclusivity or the of the brand, you know. So I just thought that that was always a very interesting idea. But along with that, you got a very nice and ergonomic firearm with upgrades in every single way possible. Now, I believe that the Legion line will probably go in the future and something else will replace it. That's what SIG is known for. But while it's here, I think it is a really, really interesting design concept. And I've always been really interested in the Legion firearms. They're great, I think, value. And a lot of people, when they see the Legions, whether it's the 226, the 229, the 220, the P320, a lot of people really gravitate towards them for obvious reasons. Now, on the used market, something like this you typically find in the $1,000 to $1,200 mark. The Legions new usually range in about the $1,000, or depending on what it is, about $1,000 to $1,400 respectively. But they do maintain a lot of their used value, especially right now in this current market where it's hard to find them new. So really interesting firearms. If you get a chance to take a look at a Legion, I definitely recommend you pick one up. And definitely if you can take one out to the range, I don't think you would be disappointed. So really interesting firearms. I'm glad to get this one in to share it with you guys. Okay, up next is a popular rifle I'm sure many of you recognize, and this one comes to us from a local customer. This is an Egyptian Hakim rifle chambered in 8mm Mauser. Now, if we look at the Second World War, a lot of the countries around the world are thinking about moving from what was then traditional as the standard bolt-action rifle and moving into something that would be semi-automatic. During the Second World War, a lot of countries had actually gone into this. You would see the United States with the M1 Garand, you would have Russia with the SVT-38 and SVT-40, Germany with the G41, later the G43 rifles. But after the Second World War into the 1950s, that's where you see a lot of development into semi-automatic gas-operated shoulder-fire rifles that are meant to serve as the basic or the main infantry rifle in countries around the world. This is the period where you see things like the FN-49 come into existence, the SETME Model C. You have things that are moving into select fire full power rifle cartridges, the German G43, in through the 60s with the M14 in the United States. But this sort of concept of the full-size semi-automatic battle rifle is gaining a lot of prominence. Now, Egypt would be no exception to that. So through the Second World War into the late 40s, King Farouk I was looking into modernizing the Egyptian military, moving away from the traditional bolt-action rifles. Now, they had first received lots of surplus firearms from Germany, 8mm Mauser, different Mauser action rifles, and all the ammunition that would go along with it. So they wanted to modernize with something in the 8mm caliber. Now, one of the popular rifle designs that was becoming prevalent in the 1940s was FN-40, was the FN Model 49, of which Egypt would actually be one of the largest purchasers and was secure a large contract for rifles and accompanying parts to be delivered to Egypt and the 8mm Mauser cartridge. Now, in my opinion, that was a superior rifle to the Hakim. But later, Egypt would move into the Hakim, and about 1951 or 1952, King Farouk would actually be overthrown and forced into exile. He would abdicate to Italy. And this would actually be the end of the monarchy-type system in Egypt. A provisional government would be put up in place, and Egypt would turn into a republic, with the new government taking hold. They want to do something, of course, what most nationalists usually like to do around times like that, is to move into their own at-home arms development. So they would look into developing the new rifle, which would lead into the Hakim. So other developments of semi-automatic rifles at the time, we have the AG-42 or the Jungmann being produced in Sweden. So they would look at that design, they would purchase tooling from Sweden, bring it over to Egypt and start making at-home manufactured Hakim rifles off of the AG-42 pattern. Now, of course, it would be an 8mm Mauser. They would incorporate things like a gas regulator up here at the front of the rifle and add a couple other features to suit their needs as a service rifle as well. Thus, it would replace the FN-49. These would go into production in about 1953, 1954, and would in production in about the 1960s. Later, it would be produced by the AKM pattern rifles throughout about the 1960s, but these would actually be well regarded by the Egyptian military during the time that it served. Now, one of the most popular features about this in terms of collectability is how the action works, but it also is one of its largest hindrances. You have a dust cover up here at the top. In order to load the rifle, of course, if the rifle is not unsafe, you bring the dust cover forward, allowing you to pick up the bolt and carrier. You bring it to the rear, and that will lock it on the magazine follower. You then will pop in your rounds via a stripper clip. Once loaded, and I'll have to remove the magazine to simulate this. Once loaded, you will then bring the dust cover forward slightly, and then back, making sure your hands are out of the way, and that's what you would do to commence firing. Now, if you did have ammunition in the firearm and the firearm is off safe, you go to pick up the carrier and bring it back. It will go back into battery, even if you don't intend it to. You'll have to bring it onto safe in order to get it to lock open if there's no empty magazine inserted. As you can see, if you're under the tense conditions of a firefight or anything like that and you're trying to service or operate the weapon, clear a jam or malfunction, it is very easy to get your hands caught in here or to have the weapon off safe like this and accidentally end up, snagging a thumb or something, which I hear from people that has happened to is worse than in one grand thumb. Interesting rifles nonetheless, and they've gained somewhat of interesting popularity here in the United States as a collectible. Again, I think it's a lot of the oddity around it, plus the 8mm Mauser round. It's a popular cartridge and pretty easy to find here in the United States. Now, lately they have been creeping up in value. In this condition, this one's actually in one of the best conditions I've ever seen a Hakim. You typically find these actually somewhat climbing up over $1,000, surprisingly enough. I think that's really high for what they are, but that's what they're bringing. So $700 to $1,000 is pretty typical for a Hakim these days. I remember even 3-4 years ago, you could find these at gun shows between $500 and $700 respectively. So like every other surplus rifle, they are still climbing. Definitely worth to get your hands on if you find one at a pretty decent price, while the price is still lower than what it's likely to be in the next few years. So, interesting rifle. Happy to get that in and share it with you, the Egyptian Hakim. Okay, up next is a very interesting and pretty uncommon pistol that comes to us from a viewer in California. Thank you so much for sending this one along to us. This is a Sig P229S, S standing for Sport. Now, these were manufactured exclusively in Germany between 1998 and 2005 when they would be brought into the United States. These are manufactured at Sig's custom shop in Germany, and it was said that each one of these got individual intention from a certified Sig gunsmith, and it was sort of hand-fit and finished to lead it into being really what it was meant to be, was a finely tuned and honed in competition or shooting enthusiast pistol, something really meant to edge into the Sig market beyond what it was really known for, which was police service and duty weapons. They wanted to get more into the sort of higher end, impressive race guns or competition shooting guns in the late 90s. Now, these would only be produced till about 2005, so they had a relatively low production run, probably for a few reasons. One is their commercial success in the market, and the other is the cost of manufacturing these. They did sell brand new at the time for about $1,300. Since then, on the used market, they've gone up a little bit over that, again, because of their sort of rarity, and they're a little bit difficult to find, but, you know, 1,300 plus-ish is about where they run, depending on condition and what they have and whatnot. A couple unique features about these is these were offered exclusively in 357 Sig. They came with two 10-round magazines, rubber Hogue wraparound grips. The standard P229 had a stainless steel slide, but an alloy frame. The 229S had a full stainless steel slide and frame, giving it a really nice overall heft, weight, and balance. And of course, the iconic compensator moderator out here at the front with a 4-inch barrel, adjustable sights, and sort of Sig's early SRT short reset trigger. Really, really low reset, really nice target trigger. Now, this would be the precursor to the X series from Sig, and like I talked about with the P220, you know, the Legion that we just showed you, Sig was always known for taking an existing design like the P229, which was a derivative of the P228, which came out of that, and sort of redesigning it, restructuring it, and trying to come out with something refreshed on the market. Now, again, because it only would be produced from 1998 to 2005, only a 7-year production run, and because they were a custom shop gun, not very many were produced each year, that led these to actually be very low in production numbers. I wouldn't quite, maybe you would call them collectible, but for those people who are interested in rounding out a Sig collection, something like this would be of interest to them. But it is a very unique and interesting pistol nonetheless. I'm very excited to get that in and share it with you guys. And actually a very excellent condition, original box. And factory test target, which actually shows, I don't know what distance they shoot at, but a 1.81 inch group using Federal Classic 115 grain. 25 meters, so pretty nice group, nice target pistol. Glad to get that one in and share it with you guys, a P229S or P229 Sport. Up next is an interesting rifle that comes to us from a very good local customer of mine. This is a Norinco Mac 90. You guys have seen this on my recent shop tour video if you watched that. Now, the story with this would begin back in the 1980s when there began to be a very much growing demand for a traditional Soviet-style AKM or AK pattern rifle. At the time, there existed the Valmet, the Finnish AK pattern rifles that didn't really have the traditional lines of what you would think when you think of, you know, a Russian or a Kalmblock AK-47. Now, the first company to really bring those into the United States would be Steyr, and they would import the Mahdi rifles off of the Egyptian pattern, which are really close to the original Soviet AKM design. Now, the only problem with those is they were a little bit expensive, but because those came into the country, they were used in different pop culture outlets like the 1980s version of Red Dawn. The U.S. consumer market would grow and the demand for these would grow, so that would usher in other entrants into the market, such as Norinco and Polytech with the Chinese variants of the 56 pattern rifle, the 56S, the S1, the S2, the S3, and of course the Polytech Legend on the milled receiver. Now, those would come into the country between about 1986, 1987 to 1989. Now, 1989, unfortunately, a very bad event happens known as the Stockton Schoolyard Shooting, in which case a low-life degenerate takes a Type 56, I believe it was an S1 Norinco rifle, and uses it to shoot at children on a playground in Stockton, California. That would lead to a huge panic within the American public, of course, as oftentimes those things do. And they would lead to knee-jerk reactions in Washington, and then President George Bush Sr. would pass an executive order putting a sporting clause in the importation of so-called assault weapons. Now, this would mean firearms coming into the country would have to have a sporting purpose. There were provisions put in place to signify what sporting purpose or what sporting firearms were, and those would include things with thumbhole stocks, limited capacity magazines, non-threaded barrels, non-bayonet lugs. So Norinco would have to conform their rifle to meet this new importation executive order put in place by the president, George Bush Sr. Now, in 1990, they would come out with a new rifle to meet those requirements known as the Mac, M-A-K 90 for 1990, M standing for modified, so modified AK of 1990, the Mac 90. Another variant known as the NHM91, an RPK style with a long barrel, a bipod, and also a thumbhole stock would come out in the subsequent year. Now, those would be the ban compliant, or I don't know if you would still call those, I guess, post-ban, post-importation ban AK patterns. Now in 1994, then President Bill Clinton would pass the assault weapons ban, which would terminate all importation of these firearms from China, and that importation ban still exists today. So if you want a Chinese AK, you're left with the Mac 90 or the pre-ban, pre-1989 ban AKs. Now, if you're looking at getting into a Chinese variant, of course your options are limited because they were not manufactured for very long. But the pre-1989 ban Norinco and Polytech AKs go for quite a bit more than do the Mac 90s, mainly because of their watered-down appearance on the Mac 90. Now the good thing is you can take off the thumbhole stock and put on a traditional pistol grip and stock. You can thread the muzzle if you want to put a sugar scoop or a muzzle nut on there. So you can modify these into somewhat of a traditional AKM pattern without these watered down features on there. Of course, it's going to take some looking around for parts and things if you want traditional, Chinese wood, and it is hard to find that stuff, and it's very expensive when you do. So as an alternative, other than these features, they are a real Norinco AK and a really good quality at that. So you can pick these up for quite a bit less than what you will pay for a pre-89 ban AK. So really affordable and a good alternative to those rifles. So again, really happy to get this in and share it with you guys. This is a Norinco Mac 90 AK. Okay, up next is a very interesting rifle that comes to us from a viewer in Oregon. So thank you so much for sending this one along to us. This is a Steyr Manlicker Schoner, model 1950, chambered in .270. It is a very, very well-made, beautiful sporting rifle, very much known for their attention to detail and craftsmanship. Now the story with this would begin back in the late 1800s and about 1895 with the adoption of the 1895 Steyr Manlicker rifle by the Austro-Hungarian military. It was a straight pull and block clip fed rifle, which is very well liked and perceived by the Austro-Hungarian military as well as others. Now, at the turn of the century, we have somewhat of an arms revolution going on. You have the movement from black powder single-shot rifles to Spitzer magazine-fed repeating bolt-action rifles, and a lot of different designs, the Mausers, the Mannlichers, are coming on board with these different sort of revolutionary designs. Now, Steyr wanted to continue with sort of changing the game on what was going to lead into this new generation of military service weapons. So they started development of the Steyr Manlicker Schoner rifles, and in the 1900s, or early 1900s, around the year 1900, they introduced their first variation of this pattern at the World's Fair, and it was really meant to be targeted at military application as well as sporting use. It was moved from a straight pull to a turn bolt action, similar to the Mauser design, with a split ring rear receiver, which was to give it added rigidity and safety, extra durability here in the back when it was locked. You have a Mauser style safety lever in the back. And most importantly, you had a rotary magazine, which is, I guess, a spooling magazine, so you could have a higher capacity magazine without having to add anything additional to the bottom of the gun, thus keeping a very thin profile and ergonomic aesthetic, which was deemed by many to be a really good sort of approach to the modern military rifle. Now, the problem with this came with the added cost and complexity of manufacturing, which is why it did not see a lot of military use and application. Now, where it did get some attention was with the Greek military, who was using the Gra rifle at the time, black powder. They themselves were looking at transitioning to a modern military rifle. Steyr was producing the Gra rifles for Greece at the time, so it was easy to try and get them to transition to the what would then have been the first production run of the 1903 Steyr Manlicker Schoner rifles, which they would adopt, and that would be really their only success in the military market. They would then pivot to the commercial market, again with the 1903, with this very iconic spoon-shaped bolt. You had the internal rotary magazine. They would put them in nice sporting stocks with this high-polished blued finish. Difficult to mount a scope, but it could be done by mounting it to the front of the receiver ring, and saw a lot of success in the sporting market. This was actually a little bit of pop culture trivia. In the movie Schindler's List and the infamous balcony scene, that was a model 1903 Steyr Manlicker Schoner rifle. However, Amon Goeth, the original scene, would have been assumed he would have used a standard K98K rifle, which is what the photographs would dictate, but in the movie they elected to use the Mannlicher Schoner rifle model 1903, so a little bit of pop culture reference there for you. Now, these would stay in production and would be very, very successful in Europe in the sporting market. Then World War II would come about and they would cease production on these. Steyr was focused on other arms manufacturing at the time. Then in 1950, a little bit after the conclusion of the Second World War, they would come out with a new model known as the 1950. It was really meant to be marketed towards the American consumer market, so it would be offered in calibers like 243 and 270, which is what this is. And the model 1903 as well as the 1950 had a bolt handle that actually came straight down, sort of laterally right down the side of the action. Now in 1952 they would come up with the final design iteration of this, and they would swoop back the bolt handle. This actually has a swept back bolt handle, but the bolt is matching to the gun, so this is pretty uncommon. It's got a 1952 bolt configuration on a 1950s model. Also the 1952 bolt would be in the white, and this one is blue to match the rest of this model 1950, so it was likely a factory custom option or something like that when originally built. Beautiful, beautiful rifles. Again, really known for their high quality and just great craftsmanship and attention to detail. Known by many, including Ernest Hemingway, as being one of the best sporting rifles ever made. Very cool rifle. Now on the consumer market, they range in a lot of different ways in terms of value, whether you're looking at a 1903, a 1950, a 1952, or the caliber you're looking at, the condition. Typically anywhere from $1,000 to $2,000 is mostly where you see them. Some of them less if they're in lesser condition, but some of them go for more if they're a more rare variant or in pristine mint condition. So anyway, very interesting to get in and happy to share that with you guys. Steyr Manlicker Schoenauer, model 1950. Okay, last but not least, I have an interesting firearm coming to us from a viewer in Illinois. So thank you so much for selling this one to us. This is a French Manurhin or Manurhin. That's how I'll pronounce it in this video because I'm not French. Model MR73 357 combat revolver, and this is sort of the peak of what you can get out of a very refined, very well manufactured combat or service revolver, if you will. Now this would see service in the French Gendarmerie in the 1970s, as well as the GIGN, which is really their police special forces or special intervention forces, somewhat equivalent of what you would say is like a GSG-9 or American SWAT teams or anything along that nature. So in the 1970s, the French GIGN wanted something in a revolver format to be used as their service revolver, but they wanted something that would outperform other really nicely manufactured and tuned revolvers of the era from the 1970s. Things like offerings from Smith & Wesson or the Colt Python, which in testing really couldn't stand up to the very rigorous and repetitive use of something like a police service sidearm that would see a lot of, range qualifications, range use, training, and that sort of thing. Usually the Pythons and other things were relegated mainly to collectors and target shooters who were not putting nearly as many rounds through them. So these can, withstand tens of thousands of rounds of ammunition and still continue functioning. Finished in a very beautiful high polished blue. The application of a service revolver in police or a special weapons and tactics sort of environment, usually something like this is good to be able to use one-handed and to mitigate any type of a stoppage in the sidearm that would require both hands to clear. You see this used typically with like ballistic shields and things like that, where you can provide your sidearm around the shield. You can manipulate it with one hand, and the chances of it jamming or malfunctioning, or you will need that offhand, which is usually supporting your ballistic shield, to clear the malfunction is not very likely. This is a similar principle put into the Smith & Wesson R8 revolver that we took a look at several months ago. That's one definite advantage of employing a revolver as a sidearm. Now the MR73 has also made a splash on the consumer markets for target shooting in France, as well as especially the United States. Now I did tell you that we had a conversion 9mm cylinder. Now an interesting note, in France where these are manufactured, obviously, they are not allowed, or civilians there are not allowed to own firearms chambered in calibers that are used for war. Since 9mm is a military cartridge, they cannot have the conversion cylinders there, so this is typically things you find on the US market or other countries where this sort of thing is allowed. And they are not too easy to find, the 9mm conversion cylinders. Also, as mentioned, these come into the country now. Beretta has actually purchased manufacturing rights to the Manurhin revolvers. They manufactured them as of 2001, so as of just recently they started bringing them into the country. You typically find them with these large rubber target grips on them. Previous owner went out of the way to get original combat grips, the wood grips, which are just a nice addition to something like this. So really interesting. They are just very, very well crafted revolver. So if you want that sort of nice, target accuracy, that feel, that beautiful trigger pull, smooth as glass, but something that can withstand tens of thousands of rounds and really be rugged and durable, the Manurhin MR73 is definitely the option in that regard. Now, because of their rarity and their fine attention to detail, craftsmanship, durability, the pricing on them is pretty high. They tend to hover around the $3,000 range, plus or minus, depending on condition. So somewhere around there is about where they go, a little lower, a little higher in some cases. But anyway, really happy to get that in. Manurhin MR73. Just an excellent firearm. This is maybe the second one we've ever had, so they're not too easy to come by. Again, big thanks to our viewer in Illinois for selling this one to us. Well, that is all the time I have for you today on these. Thank you so much for stopping by and checking out this video. If you enjoyed, please let me know by hitting that like button. Please also consider subscribing to my channel and hit that bell notification button so you are aware when I am posting new content. Anyway, guys, I'm going to leave you off with that. I am Chris with Marksman Shooting Sports and WeBuyGuns.com in Westfield, Indiana. You are watching Marksman TV, and I will see you next time.